Let's begin our class. Sorry, everyone. We're in the third canto of Dante's Inferno. I want to get through several of them today. So the third canto, third canto begins with the entry into the hell proper, with the famous inscription on the gates of hell, which are in the translation often capitalized here. But and I want to talk about this briefly because it touches on one of the main themes of Dante's portrait of hell, which is although I said that the whole of the Commedia is categorized and understood in terms of divine love, it's also that does not contradict the justice of what is happening. And I want to talk about that theme in a second here, but let me begin with just reading the inscription that Dante describes on the gates of hell. Through me, the way into the suffering city. Through me, the way to the eternal pain. Through me, the way that runs among the lost. Justice urged on my high artificer. My maker was divine authority, the highest wisdom, and the primal love. Before me nothing but eternal things were made, and I endure eternally. Abandon every hope, ye who enter here. Abandon all hope, ye who enter. That's a famous phrase, the last little section of that, last line of that description. Now, it must be quite a broad gate if it has all of those words written on it. But remember, this is not something Dante actually sees. It's a vision, and he is thinking about the way in which the hell that he's about to describe comports with divine justice. And furthermore, with the idea, which is the preeminent idea, that God is love, that he is a loving being, and everything that he creates, he does so out of love. And I said to you last time that one of the things that will characterize the sins is that the love, they are variations of love, but they're misapplied loves. And there are different consequences to that. And largely, they're horrific. In fact, they're all horrific in some ways. And they get more horrific, the punishments, as the Dante follows Virgil down into the Inferno, into the pit of the Inferno. And I put on the screen behind me a visual description of these punishments. It starts off in Limbo, so it starts off going through the gates of hell down here, and then through Limbo, which we'll find in Canto 5, and then Paolo and Francesca, who we'll meet in Canto 4, and we'll meet them in Canto 5, and then we'll go on down. Now, as we go down into hell, we will find that the confines get narrower and narrower, more and more compressed. The other thing which is more surprising is that hell gets, as we descend, gets colder and colder. And whereas Paolo and Francesca are blowing around here in the breeze and have no control over themselves in the same way they had no control over their passions, as we descend into hell in its deepest, darkest confines, because it is dark, it's also cold, and the people are encased in ice, wholly encased in ice, so they can't move. Now, when Dante's describing this, he's using the scientific understanding of the day, and heat and cold at the as points of opposition and so forth. But his description, I could say more about that, but I don't want to spend too much time talking about that. But suffice to say, hereafter in literature, a cold landscape or a frozen landscape is likened to a hellish landscape. So in the novel Frankenstein, the Frankenstein monster goes up into the Alps and he's on the glaciers. And in Russian literature, ice, and even in some Canadian literature, ice has the connotations of a hellish landscape. It's not a welcome place in which to live, which some Canadians will agree, and many more foreigners who visit here, particularly if they've come from warm countries, might agree to as well. It's rather hellish. But that's not his point. His point isn't to say that hell is a cold place, because he reads also in Scripture that of the fires of hell. He's not contradicting that. He is fitting it with the scientific understandings of his day. As I say, this is an encyclopedic epic, and he is using the scientific understandings to fit with these sorts of ideas. But I'll come to that when I come to it. But in the third canto here, there is a second grand shift in perspective. Remember, I said in the first canto, he tries to climb up Mount Purgatory. He's down in he's in the middle of life's journey. He finds himself lost in a forest. He sees a light at the top of a hill to get out of it, and he wants to climb up it. He finds himself obstructed by 3 beasts, and he is so scared he goes back down to the bottom of the valley, and he can't get up it, and there he meets Virgil. And then in the second canto, which is now an invocation, so that encyclopedic, or rather that epic feature, he invokes the muses for help to tell him the story of what he's about to undergo. He now is accompanied by Virgil, and he's been called, he learns, by a divine lady who happens to be Beatrice, who we'll meet much later on in the epic. But he's now going to, so it's a second go at it. And remember, I said also that in the Inferno there are 34 cantos. In the other 2 canticles there are only 33. So it's 100 as a whole, but this number 3 is important. In the third canto, there's another shift in perspective. It's less allegorical now. It's the renderings are more descriptive and to be taken literally, although I would say he says throughout you have to read this on multiple levels, but it's more we can see what's going on, understand what's going on. We can visualize it. And the words on the gate, though, tells us that the occupants of hell are cut off from God, and it is a city, which I will expand upon later on when we get into the city proper, which is in the 8th canto. The city of Dis is what it's called. One of the words in the Latin language for the underworld, Dis, hell. That's the name of the city, but it is a city. And to some degree, it might be the city of Babylon, Babylon the Great. Like, remember in the book of Revelation that we are presented with this very apocalyptic vision of 2 cities at war in this world. On the one hand, there is the whore of Babylon, and it's persecuting the saints, and it's trying to stop the Messiah and so forth. And on the other hand, you have the saints washed in the blood of the Lamb, who are in the end rescued by the Lamb, saved by the Lamb, and are part of the heavenly Jerusalem, which eventually comes down from God and brings to a conclusion this temporal order and brings in a new heaven and a new earth. But those idea of 2 cities, Dante presents this hell as a city. It's not because he likes the countryside. It has more of that theological sense. There's an organized rebellion against God, and there are people in there. And one of the interesting things about hell is the punishments that are visited there are often at the hands of other people. So there's a sort of a proverb, I don't know, it's in the 20th century, that hell is other people. It's not quite that in Dante, but often the punishments come at the hands of other people. The people are punishing one another, and Dante's and the principle that will explain what that is, I will come to that as well, because there is a very clear rational principle that he calls Contrapasso, but I'll come to that in a second. But the reason that they are there is because they rejected God's love. The rejection of God's love by the sinner it effectively exiles them where they are. They preferred something else to God, and that landed them where they were. So it's just. Remember, justice, love is one of the words that's used to describe God. In fact, God is love. It says in 1 John that God is love. It also says that he's light. So we'll find that both of these have theological implications, even in Dante's portrait. So in hell, it's a very black place. That's because God is not present there. It's a place remote from God. It's far from his presence, and yet it has been marked by God in the sense that it was created by him. And it says in verse 6, 5 and 6, justice urged on my high artificer. Who is that? God. God created hell by a sense of justice. When did hell come about? When sin came about. It didn't exist before that. When sin entered into the world, hell entered, and my Maker was divine authority, the highest wisdom, and the primal love. That again strikes us as a little bit odd, because in the contemporary, very pagan and not particularly Christian understanding of God's love, he couldn't possibly punish people for sin. That would not be loving to judge, let alone. Who is God to judge? He ought to, if God is love, he ought to include everyone and accept everyone, right? And if they say they're sorry, that's just the end of it, right? And even if they don't say they're sorry, surely an act of love will just allow them, just forgive them. It's not beyond God, surely, just to forgive. Well, that's not Dante's understanding. And I would say furthermore, it's not Scripture's understanding. Because if it were, the Son of God would not have to die on the cross. And the cross is at the center of Christian theology, and it's at the center of Jesus' own mission. He actually says that, for this reason I came, to lay down my life, right? For this reason. So he's come into the world. God has entered history as a man, and he came precisely in order to die. And he did that. So here's the question, why did he do that? Is it to save sinners? Yes, but it has another reason, and it may be a higher reason than that. It's to appease the wrath of God, who is incensed at human sin, because sin is a violation of God's love. Original sin and all the sins that have come after it have never been atoned for. God has never been propitiated. The temple sacrifices in the Old Testament are there, but they can't take care of the problem of sin. God remains wrathful, so if he is going to be just, he has to take care of original sin and all the sins thereafter, and only he can do that because he is the only sinless one. Remember, go back to what I said about Ovid and about the account of Genesis. God is not a creation. He has uncreated being. Right? He creates everything ex nihilo, out of nothing. That means he's not implicated in the fall. That means he can also solve the problem of sin, because he's not implicated. He's not a sinner. So now, in order to bring about justice, Jesus will bear the wrath of God. That's justice. It's also just that those who have rejected God and have refused to repent end up being where they want to be, which is loving the things that they loved to the very end. So that C.S. Lewis portrays this to some degree in The Great Divorce. If you ever come to read that, people want to be where they are. They don't want out of hell. They're not in hell knocking, wishing they were out. They're very happy to be where they are, in the sense that they don't want to be with God. They're not happy in the sense that they're suffering. They are happy in the sense that they would refuse any offer to remove them from that, if it meant having to repent, because they love their sin. So there's a perversity to this. So that's the first thing here. So they can reject God's love, but they cannot create justice themselves, and they can't orchestrate what will happen out of this. So the Inferno is a part of a redemptive universe. That's what I want to say here. Those who are in the Inferno have rejected God's love and not repented. Those who we will find in the Purgatorio and in the Paradiso are those who have repented and accepted God's love. Those who are in Paradiso no longer have any traces of sin. So it's part of that redemptive universe. So the souls of the damned, and this is Dante's portrait of it here, have lost all the good of the intellect. That's how he described it. So I'll go to those lines, 16 to 18, or even from 13. Virgil to Dante, he to me as one who comprehends. Here one must leave behind all hesitation. Here every cowardice must meet its death. For we have reached the place of which I spoke, where you will see the miserable people, those who have lost the good of the intellect. Now, Dante presents this in the middle of, I said to you, in the middle of the high Middle Ages. This is the age, and this is something that people find very hard to grasp, because the portrait of the Middle Ages is of people who are irrational and akin to pagans. Afraid of the dark, and when it was lightning outside, they would quail in terror, and they really were motivated by mythology and superstition and all sorts of vulgar, really childish ideas. But if you look at the literature of the period, this is a far more rational age than ours. And Dante's explanation here is highly rational. That, in fact, that's what he says. They've lost the good of the intellect. Now, my response to that would be, while that's true, there's a lot more to it than that. But Dante is writing in the middle of the Renaissance, when reason is considered to be the most important thing. And that's the real problem here, is a fall from reason. I think there's more to the consequence of the fall than a fall from reason, but it's never less than that. But he presents it almost only rationally. It's a failure to understand properly. So they've lost all good of the intellect, they have lost all knowledge of God, and therefore there's no hope of redemption. There's no hope of learning. They can't change their ways because they've totally lost the good of the intellect. They're obsessed with their sin, and there's no thought. Because if they had a thought, they might be able to come out of it. Now, that doesn't explain to me how Virgil can't figure it out then, because he hasn't lost the good of the intellect entirely. But that will come in a different understanding, that reason will take you, and this is Catholic theology, reason will take you up to a certain point, at which point faith is necessary. It's like a 2-story house. Reason will take you up to a certain degree, and what is the degree? It's all the way up to the top of Mount Purgatory. So you can understand the 7 deadly sins, and you can understand the 7 virtues, but you can't go beyond that. So that reason will lead you up there, but then you need faith to get up to heaven. That's the understanding of the day. So you've heard of the 7 deadly sins. This is part of Catholic theology, which I think has some value. And certainly here you can't understand how he categorizes sin without that understanding. But this realm that they encounter here in Canto 3 is of the uncommitted. Those who've made no choice between good and evil, including the angels that didn't choose between God and Satan in the war in heaven. Now, where Dante gets that idea that that is possible, I don't know. As in the angels, not quite sure where he gets that from. But that's what we have here right away. It's the uncommitted. Those is to say, those who live without praise. It's the anti-inferno. It's the pre-hell. Before they actually get there, they're not quite in hell, because they've never committed a sin before. They're sort of agnostics. And these now intermingle with neutral angels, which I think is a rather silly idea myself. But anyway. And then he who made the great refusal is mentioned there. And then the river Acheron, and then we meet Charon for the first time. Charon, let me come to Charon because we met him, remember last time, in Virgil at least. He was the ferryman that gets you to the other side of the river, Charon. We will meet him here, and how is he portrayed? He comes forward, line 82. He advances towards us in a boat. An aged man, his hair was white with years, was shouting, "Woe to you, corrupted souls! Forget your hope of ever seeing heaven. I come to lead you to the other shore, to the eternal dark, to fire and frost." So he thinks they've lost their way. They're going down to the underworld thinking that they're on their way to heaven, because he doesn't see them as being sent there. So what are you doing? I'm not here for the likes of you. You don't go down to hell. And you approaching there, you living soul, he says to Dante, keep well away from these. They are the dead. But when he saw I made no move to go, he said, another way and other harbors, not here, will bring you passage to your shore. A lighter craft will have to carry you. My guide then, Virgil, Charon, don't torment yourself. Our passage has been willed above, where one can do what he has willed and ask no more. In other words, God's ordained this passage. Now silence fell upon the woolly cheeks of Charon, pilot of the livid marsh, whose eyes were ringed about with wheels of flame. But all those spirits, naked and exhausted, had lost their color, and they gnashed their teeth as soon as they heard Charon's cruel words. They execrated God. In other words, they poured abuse on him. And their own parents, and humankind, and then the place and time of their conception seed, and of their birth. So they cursed everything good. Then they foregathered, huddling in one throng, weeping aloud along that wretched shore which waits for all who have no fear of God. The demon Charon, so there's the portrait. He's portrayed as a demon. So Dante's underworld, he's no longer just a scary metaphysical creature. He is a demon. And he is the ferryman. And he has eyes like embers. By signaling to them, has all embarked. His oar strikes anyone who stretches out. So anyone who tries to reach out to those that are on the bank, he whacks with them an oar. So down they go. And then, I wanted to read this and then I'll move on. As in the autumn, leaves detach themselves, first one and then the other, till the bough sees all its fallen garments on the ground. Similarly, the evil seed of Adam descended from the shoreline one by one, when signaled as a falcon called will come. So the fallen leaves metaphor, or simile, that epic simile that Virgil used of the dead and Homer used of the dead, Dante picks up again. They're like leaves in the autumn falling to the ground. Virgil adds like birds in the air, where they gather up in the autumn together and fly south. It means that death is coming, the winter. That metaphor or the epic simile is used here. And he says, my son, the gracious master said to me, those who have died beneath the wrath of God, all these assemble here from every country. And they are eager for the river crossing, because celestial justice spurs them on, so that their fear is turned into desire. So those who are going down to hell want to be there, because God drives them there. There's God's predestination involved here. By the way, the doctrine of predestination does not begin with John Calvin. You see it in Thomas Aquinas. It's just as starkly put. God ordains all things. And they want to be there, but they are also driven there. They're the secondary capacity for secondary causes. They will to be where they end up being. And he says, no good soul ever takes its passage here. Therefore, if Charon has complained of you, by now you can be sure what his words mean. Well, this is encouraging. If Charon's complaining that you're going down to hell, that's because you don't belong here. Just take that as a word of comfort. Right? You're not supposed to be here. You were lost, but this is not where you're going to end up. So that's a beginning. But now at this point, A whirlwind, 133, burst out of the tear-drenched earth, a wind that crackled with a blood-red light, a light that overcame all of my senses, and like a man whom sleep has seized, I fell. Down he goes. So he falls there. But now as if one whom sleep has seized. The sleep of what? Death. Right? That picture of death and presented as sleep in Scripture as well. He is going into the realm of the dead. He falls as if he were asleep because, of course, he's going to wake up from it as well. Yes?
Can Charon be seen as kind of like an angel?
No, he's a demon. He's even called a demon. And I don't think he's compared or likened to any of the rebellious angels. We will meet some of them down in the Inferno, but there's no sense, at least on Dante's part, that Charon is one of those. He's just some sort of, hellish being. He could be that, but Dante doesn't speculate on that here. So he goes down and he swoons there, and this will correspond with the earthquake on Good Friday. The wrath, right? So, bang. Fourth canto, now we get into Limbo proper. I won't spend too much time on this, but in the fourth canto, he is in the first circle, and there are 9 circles to hell. But in the first circle, or Limbo, there are those who were worthy, but they lived before Christ's advent, and they weren't baptized. And we will meet figures that we will have encountered already. We meet poets in particular. We meet Homer, we meet Horace, we meet Ovid, we meet Lucan, and Virgil himself will reside there. So it's in limbo. He doesn't fit. Well, you know this term limbo now. You're in a neither nor. You're not in either place. That's Virgil. That's Dante here. Yes.
You said there are 9 rings in limbo, or
9 rings in hell. Not 9 rings in limbo. Limbo's just one of them. Okay? And he will find him in the midst of the poets. So these are those who did have some of the good of the intellect, but they didn't profess Christ. They weren't baptized. So even though there's good in them, it wasn't sufficient. It was a reasonable. The reason was good and just, and there was good teaching there in some ways, but it's not sufficient to get them out of purgatory, so they can't go up Mount Purgatory, even though their teaching is important for Dante's understanding of purgatory. They can't get out of it, so they don't stop. They're not at the bottom of Mount Purgatory, because Mount Purgatory is not an end unto itself. When you've got to the top of it, then you go to heaven. So they're stuck in a pre-hellish state. Anyway, so he finds the poets there, and Dante is greeted as one of them. Another sign that he is a great epic poet. He's greeted as one of their own, even while he's writing the poem, which is a little bit proud, I should have thought. But it says, so there, 94, I saw that splendid school assembled, led by the Lord of Song incomparable, who like an eagle soars above the rest. Soon after they had talked a while together. By the way, Homer is called the consummate poet just before that in 88. Soon after me they had talked a while together. They turned to me, saluting cordially, and having witnessed this, my master smiled. Virgil. An even greater honor than was mine, for they invited me to join their ranks. I was the 6th among such intellects. So they greet him as a great poet like they are. There's a difference. He will not stay with them in limbo. But in that sense. So let me skip over that. He will see others there, by the way. He will see Socrates. He will see Plato. He will see Democritus. He will see all of the pre-Socratic philosophers are there. He will see Hippocrates. He will see Ptolemy. He will even see Averroes, and I'll draw your attention to that, line 144, who is a Muslim. He will see Averroes there, who wrote a commentary on Aristotle. He will see him there. He didn't know Christ, and yet there's a good to his intellect, and so he throws him there. That's interesting. But then he says in the last line of Canto 4, the company of 6 divides in 2. My knowing guide leads me another way, beyond the quiet into trembling air, and I have reached a part where no thing gleams. That's it. There's no light after this point. Not even the gleam of reflected light. It's all darkness now. So now he goes into the second circle, and this is the 5th canto. I'm going to spend some time on the 5th canto because it is a famous canto and is much reflected in other literature. It's meditated on. It's in artistic painting and so forth. And often it's treated as a poem unto itself. So if anyone reads only a little bit of Dante, they will read this 5th canto because of the famous depictions in it. But I'll read a little bit of this. But here he encounters the second circle where the lustful are punished. And they're portrayed as being buffeted by a violent storm, just like their passions. Remember we saw Dido and Aeneas, and Dido being moved by furor, the fire of her passions. It led her to abandon her reason, abandon her duty. She was moved by the lusts of her flesh. And Dante, or rather Virgil, likewise, was temporarily deluded from following his path. Everyone in this second circle will be similarly motivated by the lusts of the flesh. So there's a catalog, and we will also meet here a figure by the name of Minos, who's the judge of the underworld. Now, he's not the ultimate judge. The real judge of the underworld, of course, is God. So Minos must not be seen as a judge in the full sense. He's more like a bestial bureaucrat. He's a beast who, he's got the books in front of him, circle 2, circle 9, and then his tail wraps around them. And in accordance with the number of times the tail wraps around them, that's the circle they go down to. So that's all. He's like a bureaucrat. But he is acting upon what has been ordained by God. So God is ultimately the judge in this, but Minos works here. Now he's also the judge of the underworld in the pagan epics. So in Virgil, that Minos was there. But here he's presented, as I say, as a beast with a long tail. Now, let me say one final thing before we read a fair bit here. The relationship of punishment to sin. Because I said there's an exact correspondence. And the term that Dante uses in Italian, contrapasso. Passo, contra is against, obviously, and passo, to suffer. A word from the Latin from which we also get the passion, the suffering of the Christ, from which we also get the passive voice. In your writing, I hit you, that's the active voice. You are hit, you suffer the action, that's the passive voice. Some of you, when you write, use too much of the passive voice. It's flabby prose. It uses the verb to be. It's static. It doesn't really move. It suffers action, but it's not actually very punchy. You got to be aware of that. But that's just illustration of here. There's an action and there's the suffering of the action. Here they suffer a contra that is against their own desires. So what they loved will come back to bite them, as it were, and sometimes literally will come back to bite them. Here, however, not so. They were moved in this realm, the 5th canto, by the tempests of their lust, and therefore they are buffeted by their lusts eternally. They're in a whirlwind. They're always trying to get their beloved, and they can't catch hold of their beloved. And there's no grounding to it. They're in turmoil permanently. That's the punishment here. But that contrapasso here, and they are described to be like starlings, and later on like cranes. So line 40, he says, as in the cold season, like now, when fall is turning ever colder, the starling's wings bear them along in broad and crowded ranks. So does that blast bear on the guilty spirits. Now here, now there, now down, now up, it drives them. There is no hope that ever comforts them. No hope for rest, and none for lesser pain. Why no hope? Because again, faith, hope, love are for Christians. There's no hope that drives them here. What is it then? It's just lust, without hope of even achieving the object of its lust. It's a hopeless drive. While they were alive on earth, there was still a hope there. Now there's no hope to it. And just as cranes in flight will chaunt their lays, arraying their long file across the air, so did the shades I saw approaching, borne by that assailing wind, lament and moan. So that I asked him, Virgil, Master, who are those who suffer punishment in this dark air? And his answer, the first of those about whose history you want to know, my master then told me, once ruled as empress over many nations. The vice of her lust became so customary that she made license licit in her laws to free her from the scandal she had caused. So she made legal what was illegal. Not clear who he's referring to here. Occasionally he will identify the individuals. We will get a list of them. But those, she was an empress over many nations. Probably what's her name? Jezebel. She made what was illegal legal and ruled over many nations, but I'm guessing there. But her vice of lust became so customary that she made license licit, legal in her laws, to free her from the scandal she caused. She is, it's Semiramis, so okay. Of whom we read that she was Ninus's wife and his successor. She held the land that the Sultan now commands, so Turkey, Asia Minor. That other spirit killed herself for love, and she betrayed the ashes of Sychaeus. Who's that then? Dido. So Dido's here as well. The wanton Cleopatra follows next. See Helen, for whose sake so many years of evil had to pass. See great Achilles, he's also here, who finally met love in his last battle. So Paris, Tristan, he pointed out 1,000 shades. So he's hearing all sorts of famous lovers who are now, this is where they are being punished. So they're flying around in hell. By the way, many of the spirits for us could be judged in other areas. It tends to be the last act that they commit that lands them where they are. The decisive sin. But he said, no sooner had I heard my teacher name the ancient ladies and the knights, then pity seized me, and I was like a man astray. So he feels sorry for these spirits that are being punished. He sympathizes with them. Remember, he is a courtly love poet. He's talking about Tristan and Isolde and so forth, and Paris. These are lovers who gave up everything for their love. That's what courtly lovers do. And he feels sorry for them that they're being punished so. He doesn't see the justice in this. It's unjust. So Dante's own heart is on with the lovers. And so he says to them, my first words, poet, I should willingly speak with those two who go there, together there and seem so lightly carried by the wind. And he to me, you'll see when they draw closer to us, and then you may appeal to them. By that love which impels them, they will come. So no sooner had the wind bent them towards us than I urged on my voice. Oh, battered souls, if one, that is God, does not forbid it, speak with us. Even as doves, when summoned by desire, borne forward by their will, move through the air with wings uplifted, still to their sweet nest, those spirits left the ranks where Dido suffers. Approaching us through the malignant air, so powerful had been my loving cry. So they are thrilled that he's named the love that impels them, and they respond to that, and they say, O living being, gracious and benign, who through the darkened air have come to visit our souls that stain the world with blood. If he who rules the universe were friend to us, then we should pray to him to give you peace, for you have pitied our atrocious state. Whatever pleases you to hear and speak will please us too, to hear and speak with you, now while the wind is silent in this place. And then they explain who they are. And now we get the tale of these two lovers whose names are Paolo and Francesca. Paul and Francis. Paolo and Francesca. The land where I was born, and and she's speaking, Francesca, lies on the shore to which the Po, together with the waters that follow it, descends to final rest. So the river Po is up in the northeast of Italy, near Venice. She says, love that can quickly seize the gentle heart took hold of him because of the fair body taken from me. So Paolo saw her beautiful figure and fell in love with her. That's her explanation. By the way, when spirits speak in the underworld, they're not to be trusted. Like their reasoning is not that. It's not that her story is false. It's that her interpretation of the events is twisted by her own sin, right? But he loved her, and because of her body, and the fact that her body was taken from her still wounds her, because it is her physical being that she most loved because he most loved it. It was just the body, the physical body. There was nothing more to it. There was no self-sacrificial love. There was no friendship there. It was just lust. It was pure carnal lust. But she says, and that wounds her that the body was taken from her. And love that releases no beloved from loving took hold of me so strongly through his beauty that, as you see, it has not left me yet. Love led the two of us unto one death. Cain waits for him who took our life. So the two of them are here up in the second circle of hell. The one who took their life is down in the ninth circle. We'll explain why that is in a second. But these words were borne across from them to us. When I listened to those injured souls, I bent my head and held it low until the poet asked of me, "What are you thinking?" When I replied, my words began, "Alas, how many gentle thoughts, how deep a longing had led them to the agonizing pass." Then I addressed my speech again to them, and I began, "Francesca, your afflictions move me to tears of sorrow and of pity. But tell me, in the time of gentle sighs, with what and in what way did love allow you to recognize your still uncertain longings?" Note that she calls it love and he calls it love. And that even in our translator, he capitalizes it to suggest that an idol is being made of it. They call it love, but it's not love. Because if it was love, it would be in accordance with God's commands and how love ought to operate. But we're about to find out that it does nothing of the sort, because these two lovers are not just any individuals. It's a brother sleeping with his brother's wife. So it's in violation of that. How did this happen? But tell me, how did love allow you to recognize your still uncertain longings? And she to me, "There is no greater sorrow than thinking back upon a happy time in misery. And this your teacher knows." Because he portrayed Dido and Aeneas, right? So he knows about this. "Yet if you long so much to understand the first root of our love, then I shall tell my tale to you as one who weeps and speaks." And here it is. "One day, to pass the time away, we read of Lancelot, how love had overcome him. We were alone, and we suspected nothing. And time again, that reading led our eyes to meet and made our faces pale. And yet one point alone defeated us. When we had read how the desired smile was kissed by one who was so true a lover, this one, Paolo, who never shall be parted from me, while all his body trembled, kissed my mouth. A Galholt indeed. That book, and he who wrote it too, that day we read no more. So we were betrayed. Who were we betrayed by? Galho is the betrayer, a traitor. Who is the one who betrayed them? The book betrayed them. They read about Lancelot and Queen Guinevere, and Lancelot kisses Guinevere, and that leads to the adultery. And they read about that, and then they too did likewise. And so the book is being accused of betrayal, and he who wrote it too. That day we read no more, and while one spirit said these words to me, the other wept, so that because of pity I fainted, as if I had met my death, and then I fell as a dead body falls. Because the story of Lancelot and Guinevere, which brings down the whole of Arthur's kingdom, is the betrayal of the first night with the queen. It's a courtly love episode, however, and Dante himself would write this sort of poetry. She blames the poets who write this for leading her to sin. And Dante recognizes his complicity in this. In fact, he is sympathetic to them. And so he falls as if one dead here because he is guilty of their sin, or of leading them to that sin. So that's why he falls again. First time because he enters into the realm of death. So that's why he falls. This time he falls because he is sympathetic to this particular sin. He spent his whole poetic career promoting this, idolizing it. So he falls as a dead body. Now this is a symbolic death. And he needs to go through this and go through all of the sins. And we say here he's at his most sympathetic. He's very sympathetic to this particular sin. And although it is punished eternally, it is portrayed as less severe than the punishments and the sins that happened down below. Because in some sense, the love that they possess, this romantic love, is a good thing. It's just disordered here. As they go down, there will be less and less sympathy for the sin, and even he will have, in the end, no sympathy even for this sin as he goes through it and goes up Mount Purgatory. He will be purged of all sympathy for sin, and this is one of the reasons he undergoes this voyage, is to accept the sinfulness of sin. There's no good in it. At this point, he's still sympathetic to it, but he needs to be purged of that. He might have in mind the idea of marital love in Ephesians 5 there. Right? It's a picture of that. And yet here it's not a husband for a wife, it's a husband, or it's rather a brother for his husband's wife. So he falls there because of his complicity in promoting adultery. He hasn't committed it himself, but he's written about it and spoken of it in glowing terms. So that's why he's sympathetic, and that's why he also falls. He is learning here. Right? So this is the first key episode here. In Cantos 6 and onwards, we get to the third circle. This is where the gluttonous are punished. And they meet a hellhound by the name of Cerberus, who we met again in Virgil's Aeneid, with 3 heads and 3 throats. You meet him in Harry Potter as well, which plucks it right from both of them. And these are those that were, again, moved by lust of the flesh. So gluttony is punished. In the 4th circle, avarice, the love of money. So rather than the lust of after flesh or food, then it's money, but all these still are sorts of fleshly desires. That's the fourth circle. In Canto 8, we come to the fifth circle, and this is that of anger. By the way, I said the 7 deadly sins. Actually, the Inferno is not categorized according to the 7 deadly sins. It's categorized according to Aristotle's Ethics. So you'd have to read the Nicomachean Ethics to understand his description here. He seems to accept the pagan Aristotle's understanding of sin. Whereas when he comes to the Purgatorio, he is going to use a different understanding of the 7 virtues. And 3 of them chiefly are theological virtues, that's why. But anyway, it's in the, let me go to the 8th canto. I said I was going to talk about this. The 8th canto is the city of Dis. So the gate of hell. And there we find 3 Furies mentioned in Virgil as well. But here they are here. And he sees, or rather Virgil warns him not to look at the Gorgon, whatever he does, because the Gorgon, Medusa's head will turn him to stone. He won't leave there. So don't look there, but this is the place where wrath is punished. Oh, sorry, 8. No, that's... Sorry, 9 is this, or... 9 is so 9 is the gate of Dis, but I wanted to look at 8 very briefly. So this is where the wrathful and the sullen are there. So they're either they committed an angry act, or they spend their lives angry, and they're motivated by their own sense of injustice. So they don't want God's justice, they want their own peevish sense of injustice to be satisfied, and they stick there and they remain angry. You might know people like this who've suffered genuine injustice. They remain angry about it eternally. They don't recognize that they too are sinners and need God's grace. They also deserve God's wrath. They remain dedicated and devoted to vengeance, even if they don't actually kill anyone. They're wrathful and they're sullen. And so as he goes down there, they go down to the lower part of hell, and there are demons and fallen angels, and they are obstructing their way. Let me come to this very briefly. A wide circuit, we approached a place where the shrill pilot shouted out, and this is line 81, "Get out! The entranceway is here. About the gates I saw more than 1,000, line 82, who once had reigned from heaven. And they cried in anger, 'Who is this who without death can journey through the kingdom of the dead?'" And they're angry. Why are they angry? Because there's a living person who has greater priority than they do. They can actually travel through here. He's not stuck there. How is that possible? And my wise master made a sign that said he wanted to speak secretly to them. And then they suppressed somewhat their great disdain and said, "You come alone, let him be gone. For he was reckless entering this realm. Let him return alone on his mad road. Or try to, if he can, since you, his guide across so dark a land, you are to stay." Consider, reader, my dismay before the sound of those abominable words. Returning here seems so impossible. Seems like he's not going to get any further. You'd go back to the bottom of the valley of the shadow of death. "O my dear guide, who more than 7 times has given back to me my confidence and snatched me from deep danger that had menaced, do not desert me when I'm so undone. And if they will not let us pass beyond, let us retrace our steps together, quickly." Those were my words. The Lord who led me there replied, "Forget your fear. No one can hinder our passage. One so great has granted it. But you wait for me, and feed and comfort your tired spirit with good hope, for I will not abandon you in this low world. And then he goes on, like a father takes him down. And he goes to the gates of hell. So in the 9th canto, let me look at the gate here. But in the city of, which is the city of Dis. And when he does it, he will be greeted by the fallen angels and also these 3 furies. And the head of the Medusa. And there's great danger to Dante's journey is what's being depicted here. Because what he's encountering, remember, are not just the sins of the people that are punished there, but his own sins. He himself is susceptible to them. Even if he's not committed them, he gets angry. He gets lustful. So when he's encountering these, it's not only that his heart is inclined this way. He can rationalize that he ought not to do it, but there's still part of him that would like to do the things that they are doing. And he recognizes this is part of his journey, is knowing that these are things he ought not to even desire. And hence the punishment being depicted and to discourage him from even those thoughts. Yes?
But how would that, I mean, as Christians, and I guess for even Dante as a Christian, how would that be a possible idea? I mean, we do sin either way. We do desire sin. Like even Paul writes the same thing. I do this that I don't want to. How did he understand that if the philosophy is that you surely would desire all these things?
Well, so, yeah, as you say in Romans 7, Paul talks about the things I don't want to do, those I do, and the things I do want to do, I can't do. What a wretched state I'm in. I can't get myself out of it, but thanks be to God because he has brought me out of it. So he throws himself back on God's grace. That's Paul's solution to it, right? Is that he knows that his sin, even as a forgiven sinner, he keeps on sinning, which is a trouble to him because he's told there's no more sin in him. He's got a new nature. How is that possible? That's a challenge for Christian theology. Why do Christians keep on sinning? Because if you don't think that they do, you need to think again because you will find that Christians regularly sin just like everyone else. The only difference between them, and there's not the only one, but the cardinal difference between Christians and non-Christians is Christians recognize that they are sinners and also that their sins have been forgiven. And so they walk in the light of that. And when they do sin, they have to repent of it. And they desire not to sin, but they are never wholly rid of it. But in his problem is that he's sort of lost, because probably of his poetry, has lost even the desire to love God for his own purposes. He's loved love, which is a disordering of his loves. But you can't wholly rid yourself of sinful desires, although the Holy Spirit can. Because it's God within you that gives you the power to do that. Dante doesn't reflect on that here. He's presenting it as a rational decision. It's one of my problems with the whole exercise. It seems to be you need to get your mind in order, and then when you get your mind in order, then you can, at the top of Mount Purgatory, now faith fills all of that. But I would have said faith has to accompany you throughout all of those other realms as well to understand them properly. But anyway. So the head of the Medusa, the gates of the Furies, but the danger here is that he is encountering his own sin. This is why it is such a treacherous journey. One, that he doesn't belong there anyway, he's living, but more to the point, he actually is tempted by the things himself, all these sinful aspects. And he reaches in line 91 of Canto 9, the mad road. I knew well he was heaven's messenger. And I turned toward my master, and he made a sign that I be still and bow before him. How full of high disdain he seemed to me. He came up to the gate, and with a wand he opened it, for there was no resistance. O you cast out of heaven, hated crowd, were his first words upon that horrid threshold. Why do you harbor this presumptuousness? Why are you so reluctant to endure that will whose aim can never be cut short, and which so often added to your hurts? He's addressing the fallen angels. What good is it to thrust against the fates? Your Cerberus, if you remember well, for that had both his throat and his chin stripped clean. At that he turned and took the filthy road. There, line 100. So rather than the road that he was lost on in the very first canto, he takes the filthy road and did not speak to us, but had the look of one who is obsessed by other cares than those that press and not those before him. And we moved forward on into the city in safety, having heard his holy words. And he says this figure that he had met says back in 61, "O you possessed of sturdy intellects, observe the teaching that is hidden here beneath the veil of verses so obscure." So again, it's the good of the intellect that's going to guide them through all this. That's the road. Right reasoning will guide them down through this underworld. And he passes down, and I'll pick it up in Canto 11, where we'll finally get that doctrine called Contrapasso, which is now the 6th circle. It was in 10 as well. But he will there describe also the other circles and how these operate. So is that the Contrapasso, sin becomes its own punishment. That's the Contrapasso. In accordance with the sin, what motivated the sin, the characteristics of the sin, you will suffer in accordance with that. Commensurate with it. Symbolically, of course, but that's how it is. So the gluttonous, those who love food and can't stop eating, they are buried in a mass of rotten food. That's their punishment. It's rotten food. It's disgusting. That's their punishment. The misers and the free spenders, so those who are profligate, so those who don't want to give away any money, they love their money, or those who waste their money and they run up their credit card bills and don't have any regard for their responsibility with money. In both cases, the one who holds on to money and won't let it go doesn't regard that money as a gift from God. It's to be used for blood. They are punished by rolling circular weights in opposite directions and then clashing together, like weights that are measures of value. So if you think about scales, they're rolling weights, and so there's a futility to their life. They don't understand the purpose of money. In 10, there are heretics. They're buried alive in a tomb of fire. In 13, there are those who committed suicide, which is seen as an act of violence against themselves. So in 12, there are the violent against the first ring of the 7th circle. Those who are violent against their neighbors, and the minotaurs there. And in the 13th canto, the 2nd ring, there's violence against themselves. They are turned into trees that bleed. But sometimes the Contrapasso seems a little mysterious. But they're trees that are bleeding eternally. They're not fruitful. But they sin against themselves by taking the life that's actually not theirs to take. It was given to them. Remember it. That's the point of the point of life is not to satisfy yourself. It's to love God and obey His commandments. It's to love God and love your neighbor. if you decide to take your life, you take control of your life and you take it away from God. It's not yours to do that. You're not the author of your own days, your beginning or the end. That's the understanding here. So there's a sort of a bleeding suicide, and the character of Dante is seen throughout from the perspective of Dante the poet. So that's his challenge here. I think Virgil does not stick Virgil in his poetry, and Homer does not stick Homer in his poetry, but Dante, the poet, is describing Dante, the character, and they're not the same. Because Dante, the poet, sees better than Dante, the character. He's describing a man who's on a journey, who's learning along the way, but the man who's writing it already knows that lesson, otherwise he couldn't write about it. So it's got that autobiographical quality to it. As we see, what we will find, and as I said here, as you get further and further down, now we're in the realm of the violent, it's and the suffering that goes on there, Dante becomes more and more hostile towards sin. He's less and less sympathetic. He began sympathetic, so much so that he fell down as if he were dead. Now he is increasingly unsympathetic. In fact, he will even speak very harshly and even grab their hair and stuff like that. And Dante isn't a very nice guy. That's missing the point if you read it that way. He's supposed to be learning from this journey that he ought not to have any compassion for sin. Remember, when Dante's writing about this, he's not giving it as advice for how to treat people in this life. Like, you've sinned, like you're a sinner, I have no sympathy for you at all. It's not practical advice for engaging with the world around you. That's not what he's describing. Right? So it's not pastoral counsel. Right? So those who've been caught up in the sin of adultery, I'm not going to talk like Jesus. I'm going to talk like Dante the pilgrim, who's gone through hell, and I would say, well, you're a sinner. You deserve hellfire and damnation and nothing else. There's no that's not what he's talking about. He's acquainting us with the sinfulness of sin, and it's not to be understood as what's my takeaway lesson here and how I'm going to act in the light of this. That's right. Just understand that. So it's theologically motivated and throughout there. And he's already crossed the river Styx, and that wand I mentioned in the ninth canto was something like the golden bough. Aeneas has it. That's the passport down into the underworld. I don't know what the wand signifies, to be honest, why it's a wand. But that in book 9 there, when Virgil pulls out the wand, now Dante transforms. Remember I said that Aeneas, when he enters into the underworld, he is a lot like Odysseus. He's moved about by his passions. He's not committed to what the fates have decreed. He's sympathetic with Dido. He doesn't really want to do what needs to be done. Once he goes down in the underworld and comes out of it, he emerges like a Roman. He goes into it like a Trojan, some from the Tower of Troy, and he comes out. Well, at this point, when the wand is pulled out, Dante becomes assured of the power of God, and he becomes more resolutely against sin. So it's a sort of a key passage. Let me come to Canto. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here, or a fair bit, to Canto 19. And the reason I'm doing this for a very specific reason, this is the 8th circle, the 3rd pouch. I'm going to have to find a better description than this one. I know that there is a better one. He meets with the Simonists here, and Simonists are those who are guilty of corruption within the church. So they sell, they use their office to fatten their own purse. and they are dealt with by being burnt in baptismal fonts eternally. That's their punishment. They're eternally torched in the water of a baptismal tank. That's their punishment. And Dante condones here the punishment of the sinners and reveres the divine justice that happens. So let me come to this. So, O Simon Magus, hence Simonists, Simon the magician, O his sad disciples, rapacious ones, who take the things of God that ought to be the brides of righteousness. So those who use church offices to become rich are particularly hated by Dante, and make them fornicate for gold or silver. The time has come to let the trumpet sound for you. Your place is here in the third pouch of the eighth circle. We'd already reached the tomb beyond and climbed onto the ridge where its high point hangs just above the middle of the ditch. O highest wisdom, how much art you show in heaven, earth, and this sad world below, how just your power is when it allots. Along the side, so here he is particularly happy with the punishment that is being meted out, and that is because he will find a man who he particularly despises, Pope Nicholas III. Bend down like a friar who hears the confession of the penitent. We'll come to this in 49 here. And yet he is using that confession for his own gain, particularly disgraceful, betraying his vows. And furthermore, the Nicholas III who does this, I'll read this section here, I guess. Whoever you may be, 46, dejected soul, whose head is downward, planted like a pole, my words began, do speak if you are able. I stood as does the friar, who confesses the foul assassin, who, fixed fast, head down, calls back the friar and so delays his death. And he cried out, are you already standing there, O Boniface? The book has lied to me by several years. Are you so quickly sated with the riches for which you did not fear to take by guile the lovely lady, then to violate her? The lovely lady's the church. Then violate her, and I became like those who stand as if they had been mocked, who cannot understand what has been said to them and can't respond. I'll explain in a second. But Virgil said, tell this to him at once. I am not he, that is Boniface. Boniface VIII, the current pope. So this man who is Nicholas III, who is a former pope who was guilty of abusing his church office to fatten his own purse, thinks that it's Boniface VIII who's there with him, and he thinks, you're here too quickly. I thought you were coming a few years from now. And what's Dante doing other than suggesting that Pope Boniface VIII is guilt and will end up being here in this very circle of hell? Now, having read this, of course, the Pope could repent. But it's a clear indictment of the living Pope of his day when he writes this. And he says this, tell this to him at once. I am not he, not whom you think I am. And I replied as I was told to do. And this the Spirit twisted both his feet, and sighing with a despairing voice said, what is it then that you want of me? But that's what is going on here. The crime is likened to the rape of a lovely lady, which is the exact opposite of what the bridegroom, Christ himself, and those who bear the office of pastor ought to do, which is to love the bride, in this case, the bride being the church. He doesn't love the church. He's raped the church. He's despoiled the church. He's pillaged. He's fattened his own purse. Therefore, he ends up where he is here. So that's the likening here. And Dante believes that the church can only remain pure if it pursues spiritual matters, not if it acts like an earthly prince. So Dante's highly critical of the Pope and his acting like an earthly prince. He would go around in golden armor and so forth, riding out with his own papal army. Dante finds this to be disgraceful. The church has become corrupt. So it's a savage indictment of the church in his day, writing here in the Inferno. Anyway, I will pick it up next time. We'll move on. I'm going to spend particularly time on the Cantos 30 and onwards, and then I'm going to talk, and we don't have this in our outline, but I'll give you a little description of Purgatory and Paradiso as well. You don't have to read that, but I'll focus on those cantos, okay?